There are several components of DNS that we have to be aware of. I call this the big picture view. The first component we want to touch on is your DNS domain name. This is a portion of DNS namespace that can be public, which would be used on the internet, like google.com, microsoft.com would be public, or they can be private. That would be something you use internal to your company. I have a domain named rtsnetworking.com internal that is my Active Directory domain. So you can have a public namespace or you can have a private namespace. When we're talking about Active Directory, I would say AD, we will be using private namespaces. Public is always associated with a website on the internet. So you have that publicly registered so users can browse your website. But our primary focus will be private. What's interesting though, they all have the same type of name. Each one is going to have a top level domain like .com. That's the top level domain. Now, many people call it an extension, but com, net, org, mil, gov, edu, ca, any of those would be the top level domain. Then we have the domain name itself. I'm just going to say RTS. So rts.com would be my domain name. When I install Active Directory, I choose the domain name I want. If I choose rts.com, that becomes my fully qualified domain name. I have my DNS server. The DNS server is going to be used to respond to all name resolution requests. So anytime a client needs to resolve a name, that request just gets passed up to my DNS server, and it stores these resource records locally in a database. So technically my DNS server here is a database server, and it's going to store all my records. So I'm going to have a record for RTS-DC1 equals a certain address. That record would be stored in DNS. So anyone that ever queries DNS saying, I'm trying to resolve the name RTS-DC1 to an IP address, DNS is simply going to take that name, read the record, find that address, and it's going to send that address back to the client. So even if my IP address changes, DNS will always stay current. So anyone that wants to connect to me just uses my name. Easiest way to think of that, we don't know what the IP address is of the google.com website. Nobody cares because we're just using the name and we rely on DNS to resolve the name to the IP address. We also have DNS zones. DNS zones are what contain the various types of records that we actually have. A zone, think of it like a folder. It's actually a folder icon. And inside that folder is where I would have all these name resolution records. Now, when you look at this folder, it's going to be named like rts.com, your domain name. If you have 1,000 computers in your environment, then you would have a record for each of those 1,000 computers show up under this zone. And you could click straight through it and you could see every computer by name, IP address it resolves to. And that's what it passes back to your client. So the zone itself is a local copy of DNS namespace on your actual server. This term resource records, just a generic term. There are some specific types of records that we'll look at in DNS, but generically they'll just call them resource records because their purpose is to help you locate resources. They are created and just stored in that zone on your DNS server itself. Now the other part of this, DNS resolvers. The resolver is a client computer. So if I have we'll say Win 10. If I have a Windows 10 computer, this would be a DNS resolver. It simply queries the DNS server to get a name resolved to an IP address. It then caches that information. Now let's take a detailed look at this name resolution process itself.